And as we kind of jump back into Romans 10, it occurred to me that this is the summertime. It's a great time to relax. It's a great time to kind of just chill out a bit and to maybe, get away from things that are too serious. So, I just thought, why not continue in Romans and talk about Israel's rejection of God? That would be a really fun, light topic for us in the summer, right? And I know that every one of you woke up this morning highly concerned about this issue, right? You were waking up, you were thinking, like Paul's readers, you were thinking, how can I be saved if there's so many in Israel who have rejected Jesus Christ? Now, maybe that's something you have thought about, but I'm telling you, for the early readers, that was a big and hugely important issue that Paul is trying to address. But I want to do this kind of like I did last week. I want to make a little deal with you. I'd like to talk about that issue. I'd like to talk about this passage in its context, understand what Paul's doing for his readers, and then I think, hopefully, we'll begin to see how it's incredibly relevant for us as his readers today. Maybe people who didn't wake up with that question, but maybe there's other questions that you woke up with. Maybe not this morning, maybe not yesterday, but maybe in the last week or the last month or over the years, or maybe it's one that's been nagging at the back of your mind that you've actually almost been too afraid to ask, too afraid to let that question come to the surface, either about your own salvation or the salvation of others, that Paul will address as he talks about the gospel today. And again, our hope and our prayer is that this, even when there's a topic which seems kind of like to use a political term, wonky, kind of getting into the weeds a little bit on the theology and the history, that we would see that these are actually very relevant and practical concerns for each and every one of us as we live our lives, either committed to the gospel, or maybe you're even here today uncertain about the gospel. But still, this question is relevant. And we've been preaching through Romans, and Paul's been building this case about what the gospel is really all about. And in the very first chapter of Romans, he says, the righteous by faith shall live, or the righteous shall live by faith. He's been making this case contrary to the opinion of the Jews, contrary to the opinion of the Gentiles, that's most of us, contrary to the opinion in the ancient world, and quite frankly, contrary to the opinion of today, that to be right in life, whether with God, if you believe there's a God, or to be right in life with others, as many people, that's kind of the extent of their perspective today, that the key of it is to do the right things. And I would add that in the circles that many of us have walked in our lives as what we might call either evangelical Christians or Bible-believing Christians or whatever, for many of us in this room, in that category of doing the right things is believing all the right doctrines. And Paul's making the case that it's actually not about what you believe or what you do, it's about who you love and who you trust. Who you love and who you trust. And that's what's going to come out today. And I think we'll see that that's very relevant for each and every one of us. So let's jump into our text. We're starting in Romans 9, verse 30. So we're picking up the last couple of verses of chapter 9 and all of chapter 10. But I don't think really that it's going to take us all that long, because he's making really one clear point in this whole chapter about faith, about hearing, and about what it means to be right with God, right with others, and even right with ourselves. So Paul is going to pick up with this question that his readers are asking. He says, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles, and by the way, a Gentile is really just any person who's not what we would call today a Jew, a person who's not of the nation of Israel, one of the 12 tribes of Jacob, right? This is anyone who's kind of outside that. And Gentile just really technically means someone from the nations, right? So any nation that's not Israel. That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith. But the people of Israel who pursued the law as the way of righteousness have not attained their goal. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. So again, Paul's picking up this same theme again. He says, Really, the question is, how can it be fair that people who have done all the wrong things get to have a good relationship with God, while people who've done all the right things seemingly are rejected? Now, can you relate to that question at all? Can you think of any examples? Have you known anyone who, maybe you've heard the stories of someone who literally is a murderer, and they come to prison and they speak to a chaplain and they share the gospel and they receive the gospel, and part of you says, that doesn't feel very fair. That doesn't feel very fair. This guy who's murdered, who's terrorized people, who's, literally been a person who, in your mind, he's like the most depraved of all the depraved, the one who's the worst of the worst, right? The worst our society has to offer. And then all of a sudden, he just says a little prayer and everything's fine. Can you relate to that at all? Or maybe you've thought, you just see someone's life and they've had this dramatic turnaround and everyone gets excited about them. Oh, look at John. There is a John in the room, isn't there? Look at Ezekiel. We don't have an Ezekiel here, do we? Oh, your cousin's name. Well, we'll just pretend it's your cousin then. So there's Ezekiel. He's the worst of the worst. He's lived this life. He hasn't followed the Lord. He comes to faith, and everyone's super excited for them. And you're thinking, how come no one's really all that excited about me? I've been following Jesus since I was a little kid. Isn't my testimony important? Isn't my story powerful too? We can get this jealousy, or we can feel like it's unfair. And that's kind of what's going on here, is that you have in Rome, in the church, there are Jews and there are Gentiles. And if you recall, part of the reason Paul wrote this letter is that the Jews and Gentiles are fighting each other. The Gentiles are saying, hey, we're better than you Jews because we just trust in Jesus. And so, we're doing it the right way, and you're still stuck on this law thing. And the Jews are saying, no, we're better than you because, look, we've got the promises of Abraham and Moses and David. We've got the covenant with God. We were given the scriptures. We've been following God for generations. You guys are the Johnny-come-latelys. Sorry, John, again. You guys you're late to the party. What? We're better than you. And Paul's saying, wait, guys, you've missed the whole picture. And Jesus even tells a story like this, right? These farmers come to work in a vineyard. Laborers come to work in a vineyard, and he says, I'll pay you a day's wage to work in the vineyard. And they said, great, sounds good. And then there's some other folks that come like at 9 o'clock. These guys started early. 9 o'clock rolls in. He pulls some other folks. Hey, will you work in my vineyard? Sure, that's great. Come at noon. Hey, will you work in the vineyard? Yeah, we'll work in the vineyard. They come at 3. Will you work in the vineyard? Yeah, we'll work in the vineyard. And then at 6 o'clock, when it's time to pay the laborers, he gives a day's wage to the people who came at 6, the people who came at 9, the people who came at 12, the people who came at 3. He said, that's not fair. Jesus says, what is it to you what I pay? Didn't we agree that this was a fair wage? See, Jesus, the Lord, he loves to give the lavish gift to even those who come late to the party, which, by the way, is most of us in this room. So amen to that. But it's a concern. Why did these people who've had the history, who've had the relationship with God, they love God, right? They've pursued the law as a way of righteousness. They're trying really hard. And here he's talking specifically about the law of Moses. Paul uses the word law in different ways in Romans, but here he's talking about the law of Moses, specifically the Jewish people following all the 19 commandments that are in the Old Testament, every single one as best they can. And there were people who could legitimately say, I have followed it. Like Paul, who said, according to the law, faultless. Which doesn't mean he never broke it, but when he did, he went and made the appropriate sacrifices. He did everything that was required by God to be in good standing with his Creator. And yet on the basis of that, these people of Israel find themselves on the outside. And the Gentiles, who practice all sorts of inappropriate sexual practices, whose lives were filled with greed and with cheating and lying and stealing and all sorts, that they acknowledge, they admit to, they're received by God. He says the problem is that the Jews stumbled over the stumbling stone. And he quotes this passage from the Old Testament. He says, "See, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And the one who believes in him will never be put to shame." Who is the stumbling stone? It's Jesus Christ, right? And the big difference between those people who come late to the party and find their righteousness is that they've believed in Jesus Christ, and so they will never be put to shame. And the ones who were doing it by their own righteousness couldn't accept Jesus, couldn't accept him, and so they stumble and fall. Paul goes on to say, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge." Paul's saying, guys, these are great people. These are my people. I love them. Paul's not down on his people. He said in the last chapter that he would literally take on the curses of the Canaanites, the curses of the Jebusites, the curses of the Philistines. He would be cut off from God himself if only his people would come to saving faith in Jesus Christ. He says, they love God. They love God. But when the stumbling stone came, it threw them off. Since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Now, what is God's righteousness? And before you think too hard, what is your impulse response to what is God's righteousness? I think a lot of times our impulse response to what is God's righteousness is don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, be faithful to your spouse, be a good parent, pay your taxes, don't bring in speeding or anything like that, because that gets a little, but like the ones that matter, the laws that matter, right? The rules that matter, right? And coming to church probably, and, having a quiet time in the morning and reading your Bible and praying for others, and that's God's righteousness, right? And the religion that he loves, helping widows and orphans and, serving the poor. But what is it specifically that Paul says that was the stumbling stone? It's Jesus. And it says they were not willing to accept God's righteousness. So what is God's righteousness? Well, wrong question. Who is God's righteousness? Who is God's righteousness? It's Jesus. And by the way, that answer is as hard for anyone living today as it was for Israel 2,000 years ago. Because we have a desire deep inside, we do not want to be granted or charged or stated to be righteous because of what someone else has done. As good as it sounds on the surface, deep down, we really want to earn it for ourselves. We need to, because we feel that any other way, it wouldn't really count. It's not real if I didn't earn it. He says they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes it. I'm going to take a little bit of an issue with that word culmination. It is not a completely wrong translation. It is possible, but I really believe what Paul is saying, and a more likely translation, and probably the most straightforward translation, is that Christ is the end of the law. He is the termination of the law. He is the fulfillment and then the completion of the law. But either way, the point is, even if you say culmination, the point is that everything in the law of Moses leads to Jesus. And so if you follow the law, but you don't follow it all the way to Jesus, then you're not following the law, really. You've missed the point, and you've fallen short. Moses writes about the righteousness that is by the law. He says the person who does these things will live by them. By the way, the implication of that is, and the person who doesn't will die by them, right? And in the end, who ultimately can fulfill the law? And one thing that Jesus did is he taught not that the law was unimportant, but he taught that really the people who said they loved the law the most didn't understand the depth of it. He says, if you hate your brother, it's the same as murdering him. If you look at someone lustfully, it's the same as committing adultery in your heart. He's saying the problem is not that you held too strongly to the law, too tightly to it. The problem is that you didn't go into it far enough. But the challenge is the law always deals with the externals. The Jewish people at the time, but much like really all of us to this day, we prefer a law that deals with the externals. I've used this analogy before, but it's so good. I remember driving one day, and you guys, if you've been here more than just a little while, you know, like, I have an interesting relationship with driving laws, okay? I admit it, I confess, I'm not good at it. I've gotten better. It's mostly because the Holy Spirit / my wife Sonia has really convicted me, and like, you know, it is hard. That's part of, honestly, it's part of my culture and childhood that has shaped me in a very profound way, and it's been very hard to transform. I'm being very honest with you. This is not a joke. I break the laws when it comes to driving, and it's wrong. But I remember one time driving, and I pulled up to a stop sign, and what do you do at a stop sign? Well, you slow down, right? And then you keep going. So I slowed down like I always do, and as I was about to keep going, I looked up, and there was a policeman, so I stopped. And you know what I thought? I thought, ha, got you. You can't pull me over for wanting to roll through the stop sign. You can only pull me over if I do roll through this stop sign. But where was my heart? As far as Jesus is concerned, I rolled through that stop sign. But as far as the law was concerned, I was righteous and holy and good. It's such a big problem. It's so much better to live by the law if you're trying to get away with things, and we're all trying to get away with things. Living by a righteousness of the heart, that hurts. That requires a depth of honesty, vulnerability, humility that most of us, honestly, will not have until we enter glory. But we work towards it, right? We work towards it. And it only happens when you accept that righteousness has to be a righteousness of the heart. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Now, we talked about this word faith that Paul uses, and I would suggest that this is a fairly good definition of faith pretty much anywhere in the Scripture. And I know that's small, so I'm going to tell you what it says. Faith is not just believing intellectually, right? It can't be. But Paul does say, and we're going to get to this in a moment, that the first thing you need to have the kind of belief that the Bible talks about, the kind of faith the Bible talks about, the first thing you need is some knowledge. You need some knowledge of who God is, of what he's trying to do, what his plan is, right? You can't trust God if you've never heard of him. And we read that earlier. We're going to read it again in a moment. How can they believe if it has not been preached to them, right? That's only the first step. The next thing is you have to agree that it's true. Now, what does James say about this kind of faith? He says, the demons believe in God and they shudder. The demons have no problem accepting that Jesus is the Messiah. You understand that? The demons are not confused about whether Jesus is fully God and fully man, as we talked about this morning in the Catechism. The demons are not confused that Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead. And they're not confused that he did it out of love and that it bestows grace on those who put their faith in it. The problem is that when they encounter that truth that they accept and believe, they hate it. They hate it. So that's not faith. Faith is when you love it. Because faith is inherently relational. Salvation is relational. Righteousness is relational. It is about loving the righteous one. The Jews loved righteousness, but they didn't love the righteous one. He, for them, was a stumbling stone. He says real righteousness is not about following all the rules. Verse 6, the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is, bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the deep? That is, to bring Christ up from the dead. Now look, when you read that, do you know what in the world he's talking about? I'll be honest, I had to look that one up. I was like, what is he doing here? What does this mean? And I read this. G.K. Barrett has a great commentary on Romans. It's one of the 3 or so that I'm looking at. He had a great explanation of this, and I think it's right. He said, faith righteousness does not say, who will ascend into heaven? In other words, false righteousness does say that, and what it means is, for the Jewish people who believe in God, they believe in the Messiah, the concept of the Messiah, they actually had a belief, just as some still do today, that if we become a righteous people, then that will, in a sense, I don't want to use the word force, but it will precipitate the coming of the Messiah. If we get our lives straight, then the Messiah will come. So then who's responsible for bringing the Messiah? We are. Whose righteousness is required for salvation? Ours, right? Under this scheme. The false righteousness says, who will ascend to heaven and bring the Messiah back with them? That is, bring Christ. We read that word Christ and we think Jesus. The Jewish people would say the Messiah. Who brings the Christ down? Who brings the Messiah down from heaven? We need to get our act straight so the Messiah will come. Do you know that the Pharisees, one of the challenges of the Pharisees, and Jesus kind of illustrates this in his ministry, is that they took the requirements for the priests and they tried to apply them to everyone in the nation. So they were actually heaping laws upon laws upon laws on the people that were not ever intended for them, because they thought, if we add these extra laws, they called it a hedge around the law, like a wall around the law. So if we put this wall up, then you can't even get close to the laws that you might break. Then the Messiah will come when Israel is finally holy. Or they will say, who will descend into the deep? That is, to bring Christ, the Messiah, up from the dead. Meaning, who is good enough to go down and bring resurrection life to the world? Who is righteous enough to do that? This false kind of righteousness, again, it puts the onus on us, on you and me, to be good enough to facilitate a work of God. Can you relate to that at all in your own life? You know, God, if only I were a better person, then you would take this difficulty out of my life. If I were more faithful, then you would, rain down your riches on me. God, I'm a really good guy. Can I just go buy a lottery ticket and it'll be the right one? By the way, it's already won, so don't go out trying to get $1 billion. But we have almost this bargain with God. God, can I be good enough to facilitate, meaning to make easier your grace? Can we just kind of grease the path here? Make it a little easier for your grace to flow into my life? Guys, I know I've been there. I know when I've been in really hard times, I've thought, and I think very wrong, I've thought, if I hadn't done X, Y, Z, then these bad things wouldn't be happening. As if somehow God's grace is dependent upon my righteousness. Now, don't get me wrong. There are things in life that are the natural consequences of foolish living. And the Bible defines foolish living as anything contrary to the plan of God, whether it's sin or just lack of wisdom or whatever, right? There are natural consequences to foolish living. I'm not talking about that. I'm thinking about this idea that God is kind of, he's punishing me. He's punishing me because I haven't been living the way he wants me to live. Guys, which goes right back, if you were with us, to Romans chapter 1, this whole idea of the wrath of God is being poured out, right, against all ungodliness. But then we get to Romans 5, where Paul says, we are at peace with God In Romans 8, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That we can actually, according to Romans 5, boast in our sufferings because we know that they are not a sign of God's judgment and wrath. They're a sign of God's grace to help us grow and to persevere and to build our character. And so we begin to realize that it's not about God punishing us, that God's grace is not dependent upon your faithfulness or mine. It's dependent upon His faithfulness. The righteousness that we need is the person of Jesus, not our good works. Verse 8, what does it say? Meaning, what does righteousness, real righteousness, God righteousness, Jesus Christ, Messiah righteousness, what does it say? The word is near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, I got to bring something else up here, and it may not be very relevant to most of you in this room, but I imagine some of you have encountered this over the years. It was more popular in the past. It's kind of faded a little bit in terms of I don't hear about it, but it is a thing. That this verse has often been used to talk about what's called lordship salvation. The idea that if you accept Jesus as Savior, that's great, but you really need to accept him as Lord in order to truly be saved. And to accept him as Lord, meaning that you're obedient to him, that he is literally the one in charge of your life. And so if you're not obedient to him, then you don't really have salvation. And I just going to say a couple of things about that in case any of you have come across that and you wonder about it, because this is a primary verse for that doctrine. Does that fit with everything that Paul has been saying about righteousness up to this point? That if you're not obedient, then you don't have righteousness and you don't have salvation. Has it fit with what I've been sharing about this passage so far? No, it really doesn't. It really doesn't. Now, we could very appropriately say, if you love Jesus, there will be some resulting obedience, right? Children who love their parents obey their parents. People who love their bosses will follow them and do what they ask. People who love people in the military, when they love their commanding officer, they'll follow them into a firefight without even thinking, right? There is obedience that comes with love, but obedience is not love. They're not the same thing. You understand? And here, I think part of the problem is that Paul's not saying that if you say Jesus is Lord, meaning that Jesus is in charge, you'll be saved. Could you put Jesus in charge and still not be saved? What is the message of Christ? Is it that he's the ruler? Well, sure. Even when we talk about Jesus as king, right? It's not primarily this idea that he's in charge per se. Is that we have to understand lordship and kingship as it was intended originally. But Paul's going to make clear what he means by saying Jesus is Lord in just a few verses. So let's read it, and then I'll finish that little thought before we move on. He says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. When he says the same Lord is Lord of all, what does he mean by Lord? Does he mean commander? Or does he mean the God of Israel who goes by that unspoken name that we often use, Yahweh, to describe it? He says, and then he quotes, I think is this Joel? I forget. Yeah, it is Joel. He says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And in Joel, that word Lord is the word Yahweh. So Paul's saying by Lord here, contextually, Lord, I mean not just Jesus is in charge, but Jesus is the creator God of the universe who died and was raised from the dead. If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is the God of the universe and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. What does that mean? That Jesus has to be fully God. We know he's fully man. In order to be raised, he must have died, and then he was brought back to life. This is the gospel. This is what you have to, the message that you have to love. You have to love that God himself took on human form, died on the cross. He couldn't have died if he wasn't human, right? So these two lines embody all of this theology. He's fully God, he's fully human. He died for your sins, and he was raised again to life. That's the gospel. That's our hope. That's where righteousness is. It's not just believing that it's true, but loving it and loving him. And anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. You guys remember what shame means? How shame is defined particularly in an ancient Middle Eastern shame honor-based culture? Honor is when you put your faith in something, you count on something, and it comes through. It works, right? Shame is when you put your faith in something and it fails you. But if you put your trust in Jesus, you will never be put to shame because he will never fail you. He will never stop. He'll never cease. He'll never let you down. His righteousness will hold. One day when you are in heaven, if God ever does ask one of those evangelism questions like, why should I let you into my heaven? And you do tell him, with all due respect, sir, you should let me in because I put my faith in your son. Then he will indeed say, welcome. Welcome, my son. Welcome, my daughter, to your inheritance. Welcome. But if it's any other answer, you'll be put to shame. No difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. He's saying, look, Israel, look, Gentiles, you've all come by the same basis. You've all come with the same need. And if you put your faith in Jesus, you all get the same blessing. It doesn't matter. And that's the same for each one of us in this room. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter what you did last night or what you're going to do tomorrow. It matters, are you loving Jesus? Is your faith in his sacrifice and his resurrection? And again, I mean it like this. Not just like, oh yeah, that I believe that's true. I went through a definite season of my life completely in on number 1 and 2 up there. I knew who God was. I knew the gospel. My parents, my dad's a pastor. I grew up in this environment in the church, heard the gospel presentation probably every week for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. I was all in on 1 and 2. But I didn't love Jesus. That didn't come until later. And how much love is enough love? Oh my goodness. How much love do you need to love someone to marry them? A lot of people have different answers to that question, don't they? But I guarantee you this, if you don't keep building that love after you get married, you're not going to be married for long. And I'm not talking about losing your salvation. I'm just talking about like how love works, right? So the point is not how much love is enough. The point is like, how much love can I get? How much love can I receive? How much love can I give? How deep can this relationship be? There are mornings I wake up and the last thing I want to do is spend time with Jesus. So I have to stop and say, what is that about? Right? And then there are mornings I wake up and it's like, oh, I get to be with Jesus. But man, there better be some of that in that relationship. Right? And it's not about I don't want to turn this into a new law. Like, I'm going to talk about what percentage of love do you need to have in your life to have a relationship with Jesus. Like, no, that's just a new legalism. But what I'm saying is, oh my goodness, like you would consider your marriage dead if you didn't want to see your spouse ever, right? How much more with the creator of the universe who loves you, who died for you, who was raised again on your behalf, who's taken everything that you didn't want in your life on himself and given everything you do want to you, that he earned. That's what faith is, loving that person. And then he says in verse 14, because that big question still stands, why is it that the Jewish people rejected Christ and the Gentiles, obviously some of them do, but many of them didn't? How is this fair? And he says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? Why is Jesus a stumbling stone for the Jews, by the way? Is it because he didn't preach the law? Did Jesus preach the law? Yeah. Again, he said, the problem is not that you're not committed enough. Too committed. The problem is you're not committed enough. Like you're stopping too early. You're just dealing with the externals. You're not talking about the heart. And that was the issue. It's not that they couldn't accept the message that Jesus was preaching about obedience. They said they couldn't accept that he was the one who would be obedient for them and that he was himself Yahweh, the God who created them, the God who called them out of Egypt, the God who made the sea part in the Exodus, the one who led them through the wilderness as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, the one who brought them into the promised land, the one who sent them into exile, but also the one who brought them back. They couldn't accept that that's who Jesus was. How can they call on the one they've not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. It's a really interesting argument that Paul's making here. And it's partly interesting because he's about to say, but they did hear. He says, how can someone believe if they haven't heard? And if they don't believe, then how can they call upon the Lord? But faith comes from hearing, and hearing specifically the word about Christ, the word about Messiah, the word about Jesus. It's kind of making this case here, again, that righteousness doesn't come through doing something, but it comes through receiving something. You see that? Your hope is not in what you do, but your hope is in what you receive. But not all who hear receive, right? And that's the big problem. Man, any parents in here with kids who've not received the message? Anyone here whose spouse hasn't received the message? Maybe your parents haven't received the message. Your best friend hasn't received it. They've heard it, but they don't receive it. It's a hard teaching. There's no easy way. There's no easy way with this. Like, we can't ignore it. We can't deny it. And we could, but it wouldn't change anything. Faith comes from hearing the message of the word about Jesus Christ. I think a lot of us, when we get in those situations, especially long term, we start to think, well, I know they haven't accepted Jesus, but they're trying to be good. Or I know they haven't accepted Jesus, but, they believe in God. They believe in God. Maybe that's good enough. Or they haven't accepted Jesus, but, they kind of like, they respect my faith. Is that enough? And unfortunately, it's not enough. It's not enough for your loved ones. If you're in this room, that's not enough. What's enough is kind of crazy because, again, it's not some big, you don't have to do some big grand thing. You just fall in love with Jesus. That's enough. It's more than enough. That's where the power is. That's where the transformation comes from. Guys, if you're feeling stuck in your life and you're looking for that new step of growth, I'm telling you, the key is to fall more in love with Jesus. Right? It's not going to come from trying harder. I guarantee you, the harder you try, the more miserable you'll be. I've done it. I've tried it. I was actually pretty darn good at it. It doesn't work. It falls short. You find yourself ashamed. But if you fall more in love with Jesus, my goodness, you feel the blessing. You will be honored if you fall more in love with Jesus. So wherever we are, the call is fall in love with Jesus. Not all Israelites accepted the good news. But I asked, did they not hear? Of course they did. And then he starts quoting, I think he's in Isaiah and a couple of other passages. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Again, I asked, did Israel not understand? For Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. He's saying, look, my people, my chosen people whom I love dearly, you're going to be driven to jealousy by people that I haven't chosen before, because they're going to enter into my chosen love and you're going to be left out of it. He's talking about the nations, the Gentiles, most of us in this room. Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. By the way, who seeks God? Romans 3? No one, not one. And yet God is pleased, even for those who do not seek him, to extend the gospel of grace, and apart from law, righteousness that is found in Jesus Christ. But there are those whom God is holding his hands out. And it says they have been disobedient and obstinate. So as I think about how this is relevant to you and me, my first heartfelt response is, who in this room is God holding his hands out to, and you've yet to respond in love to the gift of Jesus Christ? Who in this room is, not to be offensive, but is disobedient and obstinate? And by disobedient, he's not saying that you're breaking the rules. The rules are just, I'm telling you, the rules are kind of like, it's kind of like a signpost. When you break the rules, it's like God saying, hey, you're really not with me anymore. You may not have noticed. It's kind of like we went hiking in Acadia, and we got separated. And one of us went on one trail, and one of us went on the other. Or two of us went on one trail, and three of us went on the other. There's 5 of us, right? And it's like the signposts would have been there if there had been, a sign for that kind of thing, saying, hey, you're separated. You lost one another, right? That's what the law really, in the end, is, I think, all about. It's not how you measure your life. It's how you're reminded and encouraged to get back with the one who gives you life, to Jesus Christ, right? And so is there anyone in this room who God has been extending his hands, right? I've held out my hands all day long. You've heard the gospel. You've heard the message of hope. You've been given an opportunity to respond, but you haven't yet responded, right? So if you're there this morning, I encourage you, take a moment to kind of be quiet and say, God, can I really trust you? Is this real? Is this my moment? Listen to your heart. Listen to the Lord. Listen to these words. And allow yourself to just love Jesus. He's really good. He's worth it. My second kind of where my heart goes is How many of those people we know, you and I, they're good people. They believe in God, maybe, in some form or fashion. They respect maybe even your faith. But some of them haven't heard this gospel, this very basic biblical offer of hope and love. Here in New England, I grew up in the South. It's like churches everywhere and Bible churches everywhere, and like it's kind of funny. Like you have to pass a whole bunch of churches on your way to church every week, and that kind of happens here. There actually are a fair number of buildings that are churches. I don't know how many churches actually live in them sometimes, but I think we live in a culture here that in some ways is highly churched but very lowly faithed, if that makes sense, right? So there's a lot of people who know about God, a lot of people who maybe went to church as kids, and not to disparage any, denomination or anything, but there are some churches that are less likely to give a clear presentation of what the gospel is than others. Let's just put it that way. Some who don't preach it at all, right? To be fair. And so maybe they don't really know what the gospel is. And my friends, you and I are the ones who are sent to share that message of hope with them. We are ambassadors of this message, of this hope. How will they believe if they haven't heard? How will they hear if no one preached it? How will they preach if they're not sent? I'm telling you, you're sent. You're sent. If you don't know you're sent today, you have lost all argument against it. You are sent. This is your ceremony, right? Like, you are sent. So what I like to do, I'll get my little, it's so important. It's really basic, but it's like love for Jesus as God is the root of all transformation and God honoring obedience. Love for Jesus is faith. So I'd like for you to take a moment just for yourself, with you and the Lord, or with you in your heart, or whatever. What part of this do you need to respond to today? Do you need to respond in faith to the message of the gospel? Or do you need to be thinking and praying, God, who do you have for me to share this with? And guys, I don't mean in 3 months. I'm talking like in the next couple of days, because you're going to forget about all of this. Let's be honest. This, unless you go on Facebook or YouTube and watch this again, this will not have happened in about 3 or 4 days, right? Unless you do something with it now. So who is the message for now? After that, I'm going to pray. We're going to sing a song. If you have come to a point where you want to put your faith in Jesus, I'm going to invite you to just come to me or come to someone you know who is a believer in Jesus Christ and share it with them today. As always, I'm going to be over here doing a Q&A, but if your question is, hey, I accepted Jesus, what do I do now? I'd love to answer that question. Right? But any other question you have, meet right here after the service. But take like 90 seconds just to kind of like, Lord, what do you want me to do with this? And listen for an answer.